After the encounter with the ghost, it was a bit difficult to get back on my feet again. I could tell Nick was worried about the aftermath of such a case. He was dropping by my apartment more often with small gifts or food. No matter how much I assured him I was fine, he would be at my door the next day with something in hand. What got me back into the office was when he dropped off an entire bag of oranges. There was no way I could eat these many, so I brought them in for Jimmy and Tippy. They've done just fine without their boss for a few days, aside from a pile of paperwork that still needed to be filed. The office was in running order. I met Jimmy outside the office just as she was arriving. Someone was with her and she appeared a little flustered that I had caught them together. He was a very tall and thin man, a bit on the attractive side. His teeth were a bit too sharp and his handshake was strong when Jimmy introduced me as her boss. I guessed he was a half-breed like her. With a small hint of red on her face, she told me he was her new boyfriend. They would drive into the office together and he would walk to the bus stop to get to work after. I noticed right away she was avoiding saying his name. I offered a few oranges to the pair, which they accepted. If he has a weird name, I won't laugh, I promised. They both looked at each other, nervous I may break my word. My mother named me Tupperware. I suppose that's not the worst name in the world. It's the last name that gets everyone. He started. When I didn't react to his first name, he felt comfortable enough sharing his full name. It's Johnson. My face twitched and it took everything in me not to laugh. My shoulders shook and hands trembled. I was given permission to let it out if I wanted, but I shook my head and leaned over, determined not to laugh in their faces. It was a good idea to get out of my apartment that day. Who would have known that the trick to getting over a mental scar was just hearing a bad name? My muffled giggling fit was forgiven. He preferred to use his last name, so Johnson waved goodbye as he started heading to work. From the sounds of it, he wasn't very happy with his part-time job. I told Jimmy I would pay him if he could help with the filing as another part-time gig. She was pretty grateful for the offer. It would help him out a lot and they could see each other more often. I started doing regular jobs once more. Some creatures came into the office looking for some help, but most requests could be dealt with a trip to the corner store or by digging around the box of treats I wisely stored beside the desk. It was the type of day that really helped me to get back into a normal frame of mind. After seeing how much I had improved, Nick was finally comfortable enough to bring me along for a case. A file had just come through and he picked it up for us. There has been an ongoing issue with supernatural creatures creating cults, or using humans to summon them to different worlds. The corporation has been able to investigate and cover up most of these events. He was standing by my door, explaining what we would be dealing with as I got ready. Our job was to go to a ghost town in the middle of a desert. I needed to double check that I had packed enough water and realized I nearly forgot sunscreen. While he spoke, I was looking through my small closet trying to find a hat for the trip. I don't mean to derail you, but what's with the shoes? I asked, when I noticed Nick was a bit taller than he should be. He looked down at his shoes. The heels were higher than normal. It was still a professional pair that went well with his suit, but a bit more feminine than usual. My previous pair was damaged yesterday. These were the only ones on hand. They are what I did not wear on the twin lizard case. He did buy a few outfits for that case. I never thought about what he did with the clothing that didn't get ruined, and where the makeup ended up. I always assumed Nick gave it away. I'd hoped we never needed to dress him up for bait again. I guessed he must have kept it all, just in case. That makes sense. What about this cold stuff? I got us back on topic. I found a few old dusty hats to pick from. Nick humored me as I put one on him as he spoke, not really reacting to how I was pulling his ponytail through the back to see how he looked in a baseball cap. The town is empty. There have been signs of summoning, but there are no creatures or humans there. Our task is simply to take photos and clear the area. If we come across a creature, we are to call for backup due to this being a case with an unknown culprit behind the summoning. Nick made no move to remove the hat. He would have kept it on for the entire case if I hadn't decided a baseball cap didn't suit him. When I finally picked one out and was packed, we were ready to go. I wasn't looking forward to being in a very hot desert looking for any traces a cult might have left behind. There wasn't even any guarantee that whatever was summoned left the area. At least this time we would have some backup if needed. A quick charm later and we stepped into an overly hot and abandoned town that looked like it belonged in a western. The main road led to a handful of buildings that looked ready to fall apart and were bleached from the sun. At the end of the road stood a handful of modern buildings, a gift shop and a small hotel for tourists. No one was around due to the entire place being closed off after the summoning was discovered. Nick started down the dusty road and I was having trouble keeping up with his long strides. He slowed down when he noticed his partner was lagging behind. The summoning circle was found inside the jailhouse. There were cells above and below ground. Thankfully, what we were looking for was in the below ground cell. It was much cooler there. The walk was short, but I was already drenched in sweat by the time we arrived to the basement. The walls were made of loose bricks and the floor was simply packed dirt. Nick needed to light a lantern for us to see in the dim room. In the middle of the floor was a circle with spellwork drawn around it. A few other items were left behind. some clothes, some candles, and some metal statues that I didn't know what they were supposed to represent. The place smelled of mold and dried blood. I guess the circle and spellwork were drawn in what I could only hope was animal blood. In the middle of the circle we found something else. 2 large and cracked open eggshells the size of ostrich eggs were left in place. Nick leaned over to pick one up. Going over it in his hands, he was trying to figure out what it belonged to. Whatever had hatched was long gone now. I took over taking photos of everything I could, trying my best to get all the needed details. While I took the photos, I noticed some tracks in the dusty floor. Pointing them out to Nick, he got down low to look them over. A set of boot prints ran alongside the strange dotted prints, as if whatever hatched from the eggs was following behind a person. Any ideas on what this might be? I asked after a long pause. I am not certain. I would like to investigate a mine nearby to confirm my suspicions. I did not like the sounds of being in an old abandoned mine. Caves freaked me out. Too many bad horror movies when I was younger tainted my concept of them. Nick straightened up and handed over my gun and holster he'd been holding onto until that point. If we saw something inside the cave, we were to leave and call for help. I still needed a weapon in case that wasn't possible. The moment we reached the top of the stairs, my cell phone started to go off. Nick let me answer it. My sister was calling. She had tried to get a hold of me the entire time I was down in the jailhouse basement. It was unprofessional taking a personal call while on a case, but Nick was fine with it. He said he would meet me by the gift shop to give us some privacy. My sister was frantic. Her car broke down and she needed to get into work in 2 days. Without any money to get the car fixed, she feared she would end up spending too much on cab fares to get to work, leaving them without grocery money for a week. I've been sending her money since I moved out. After accepting cases with Nick, I'd been sending her more. Most of what I earned went into a savings account to buy her a house when I got enough. She was raising 2 kids and I didn't think a boyfriend was in the picture. I promised her I would send her some extra money when I was done with work. I quickly went through my savings in my head, and I decided that I could afford to just buy her a new car. It was better than her trying to repair an old junk heap over and over again. With that sorted, I hung up and left to find Nick. He was inside the empty gift shop looking at some lizard art for sale. If we had time after the case, we should really come back to buy him something. There was also a wide variety of cowboy hats. We could not move on with the job unless I took a few photos of Nicky wearing different colored ones. Was your phone call important? He asked from under the brim of a glittery pink cowboy hat I'd placed on his head. Sort of. My sister was having money issues, so I told her I would send some over when I could. I told him, a little surprised at how well he could pull off wearing anything in pink. I've never really spoken to him about my sister, or gone into details about why my family kicked me out. It all was in the past and something I never thought was important enough to sit down and explain. He never asked, just like I never asked about his previous partner. If it wasn't for my sister, I would have been on the street. I lived with her for 3 years and finished school. Then we had gotten into a huge fight and I moved out. I still loved her, and we spoke pretty often. She didn't know about Nick though. He would be impossible to explain without going into what kind of work I was doing now. You are a very responsible brother. Nick's answer made me a bit embarrassed. I didn't feel as if I was going out of my way for her. I was just doing what I could and it felt natural. Hell, at this point if Nick was having money problems, I would do the same for him. Being a brother really did influence how I acted around a lot of people. Most girls I've met now were like my sisters, and I cared about them very dearly and would do anything for them if they asked. It's not really a hard thing to do. I shrugged off his compliment. As I started towards the door, I noticed Nick wasn't following. Are we buying this? He said, pointing towards the hat. I let out a laugh. He was far too easygoing for his own good. He didn't want the hat, but would wear it if I thought it looked good on him. I put it back and told him I would consider it after our job was done. I really needed to start planning what kind of costume I was going to force him to wear on Halloween now that I knew how easy it was to dress up my partner. The hike to the mine was brutal. The fun conversation at the gift shop was quickly forgotten as I was miserable in the heat. We needed to stop every few feet so I could take sips of water. How anyone lived in a place like this was beyond me. Even while wearing a t-shirt and shorts, I was overheated by the time we reached the opening of the cave. At least the further we went into the darkness, the cooler it became. I even forgot about how creepy caves were. Nick led the way with a flashlight, our footsteps echoing off the glittering walls. When I cooled down, I focused on how the stone appeared to sparkle faintly when the flashlight beam went over it. My knowledge about rocks was pretty scarce. I thought any that sparkled were worth something. That must not be the case if this mine was abandoned. I was unaware of what we may be looking for. Along the cave were ropes set up to guide people through. They led into a main cavern. It opened up into a room with unlit lamps. Tours went through this place on occasion. Nick carried on, going to the end of the room and to an opening that was roped off. It was covered with signs that said going beyond that point was off limits. If someone disobeyed the signs, the tour company wasn't liable for any injuries. A sense of stress started to sink into my gut as I followed behind him deeper into the cave. I no longer had any idea of what we might come across. The small flashlight wasn't enough to show the way through. My pack was feeling heavier with each step. The pathway was becoming tighter. After a while, we needed to walk sideways to fit through, and I needed to carry my pack in one hand. A sense of claustrophobia nearly overtook my brain as the rocks dug into my back. I didn't even think I was scared of tight spaces until that point. Nick must have noticed how stressed I was getting. In the dark, he reached out to take a hold of the hem of my shirt. His face was facing forward and was as emotionless as ever. In the short few months we've been working together, Nick had opened up a lot. It was starting to be easy for him to do small gestures like this. I was still utterly terrified on our cases, but I could handle that feeling if I was working with him. The small path opened up to an even larger space, so large that the flashlight beam didn't even reach the other side of the wall. My heart pounded from the fear of what might be waiting for us in the darkness, along with how tight the passageway was to get there. As I calmed my breathing, I could hear a noise. Something was coming from that darkness. A noise I've never heard before was causing my fear levels to spike right back up. Nick carefully stepped forward, finding a ledge. I followed him as we both looked down into the pitch black, the weak flashlight beam reflecting off of something moving below. As my eyes adjusted, I clued into what that sound was. It was countless legs moving. My stomach flipped as I watched countless long insect bodies squirming over each other. In that deep pit were a huge number of centipedes the size of house cats, all biting and trying to eat one another. I grabbed Nick's arm, not knowing what we should do next. Just as we took a step back, ready to call for someone else to deal with this, a massive shape came tearing through the smaller insect. It was also a centipede, but it was so large it could reach us if it stood up. Nick didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We both turned heel to leave the way we came. In one swift movement, he took my pack so I could fit inside the path quicker. Those insects must have heard us. All of those legs were moving closer and closer to us. As I moved, the rocks scraped against my back and chest. I heard them following us, with that awful noise echoing through the darkness. My breath caught and I nearly stopped in fear. My partner placed a hand on my shoulder to keep us going. I was in front, him behind me in case some of those insects caught up. My vision blurred as I forced my body forwards. We weren't moving fast enough. Every second more and more of those things caught up. We were going to be eaten, and it was all my fault for being too slow. My brain swamped with fear. Nick needed to keep pushing on my shoulder to get us through the last stretch of the path. I stumbled forwards, scratching my exposed elbows and knees pretty badly. Nick slipped out behind me, still on his feet. He was kicking at the few centipedes that caught up while grabbing my arm to lift me back up at the same time. We couldn't risk using his sword in the cave. It would bring the entire place down on our heads. A rumbling came in from the sounds of things. The bigger creature was going to start trying to force itself through. A large centipede leapt up, digging its pincers into Nick's arm. I raised my gun and shot it off him without a second thought. He looked shocked for a second that I was able to get such a shot off in the dark. I wasn't practicing for nothing. There were far too many of them to take out. I ran, with Nick at my heels. He would ensure none of the bugs caught up to his weaker and scared to death partner. Instead of using his sword, he used the scabbard as a baseball bat, knocking any centipede that got too close aside. The orchestra was going to be very upset that its beautiful scabbard was being used so roughly. By some miracle, we managed to get out of the cave. Nick was slowed down a little from having to tear bugs off his suit. He let me keep running, giving us some distance before he drew his sword, finally ready to take out the threat. With a few swings, he sent out shockwaves, slicing the bugs in half. It was a losing battle. More and more of them appeared, swarming out of the cave entrance, causing us to fall back into town. It was good we had put a bit of distance between us and the cave. The ground shook, and there was an explosion from near the cave's entrance. Rocks flew up, nearly landing on us, while some of the bigger ones killed some centipedes that didn't get out of the way. The larger insect we saw in the pit burst through into the sunlight. It started on the smaller ones, eating every one in sight. That gave Nick enough time to call for backup. To our dismay, some could only come in about an hour. It was up to us to hold back this creature for that long. I almost thought we could do it. That hope was crushed when a second centipede the size of a building came crashing through the stone cave. I cursed and we made a run for it. We might be able to hide inside one of the buildings for a few minutes. The large centipedes were focused on eating the smaller ones for now. We reached the saloon first. From the back windows, we could keep an eye out into the desert, keeping a lookout for when those massive troublemakers would be coming our way. I've forgotten the creatures' names, but I've read about them in my father's journals. They come from a different world made of nothing. The pair are universe devourers. They produce offspring just to eat them for strength. If they are not killed, they'll continue eating everything until nothing is left. Nick explained as we could hear the creatures rip across the sand looking for more food. Well, that was just great. We were up against something that could eat an entire world, armed with just a gun and a grumpy sword. The black shapes twisting in the sunlight. I squinted to see what the pair was doing. As far as I could tell, they were digging their faces into the dirt. Were they eating it? How long would they eat sand before they got tired and went after a more tasty target? How do we beat them? I asked, my hands sweating against the grip of my gun and not because of the heat. I am uncertain. From that I read they need to be sent back to a nothing world. Their body cannot be cut by anything. And their pincers can, well, pierce anything. Why anyone would summon something like this is a mystery, unless they confuse their names with something else. That happens often. Summoning is relatively easy, but summoning the correct creature is the hard part. If I came across the person who did this, I was going to kick their ass. They better have been trying to summon a less dangerous creature instead of putting the world in danger. But I didn't know what was worse, someone doing this on purpose or these two bugs getting into our world by accident. So far, they haven't come after us. Should we wait here for backup? I asked. Nick shook his head. No, they may be able to eat down to the core before help arrives. I'll need to go out and distract them. The less time they spend eating, the better. If I get into a tight spot, can I trust you to fire these bullets into them so we both can get away? Nick pulled out 3 bullets from his pocket. They appeared normal, but I knew these were special. He once accidentally made a bullet as strong as a bomb for a different case. Since then he hadn't trusted me with something so powerful, and with good reason. If I fired them without cover, I might get caught up in the blast. I would need to keep my distance to use these. I nodded and quickly loaded them in the magazine, ready to go. We left through the back door. Dust was being kicked up in the distance from where the centipedes dug into the ground. I couldn't keep up with Nick, so he needed to run while giving me a piggyback ride. It was embarrassing but necessary. His speed felt faster than it ever had before. I couldn't keep my eyes open from the wind and sand kicking up as he ran. In under a minute he had gotten close enough to the creatures. He set me down and took off again, ready to fight a hopeless battle. My gun at the ready and sweat dripping down my chin, I watched him closely. It was 2 against 1 and they were so big I really thought my partner was in danger. The centipedes raised their heads, noticing something coming closer. Their pincers clicked as he got closer. I nearly raised my gun and fired when one dove towards Nick. He jumped right onto the monster's head to run along its wide body. My chest hurt from fear and concern over him as the other raced down, mouth open. He jumped as the other creature crashed into the first, getting their bodies tangled. For a second, I lost track of Nick only to watch him come through the dust to land perfectly on the rough ground. A large tail came down as the creatures tried to get away from each other. Not only did he manage to dodge it, but he didn't skid to a stop when he landed. Something felt off about all this. Nicky was moving too well. I was glad for that, but confused. Every time I've seen him try and stop from moving so fast, he always skidded a bit of a distance afterwards. Now he was stopping on a dime and able to swiftly turn heel to run if needed. With those new higher heels on his shoes, he should be twisting an ankle. In the middle of watching him risk his life, a thought came to mind. Was he moving better because he was wearing different shoes? Ones with heels. Did somehow the heels make it easier for him to move around? I shook my head trying to focus. Those questions needed to be answered later. Nicky was doing a pretty impressive job keeping those 2 monsters distracted for a while. He finally landed wrong, getting his pant leg caught in a small hole. Sharp rocks snagged the fabric. He was still able to jump out of the way, tearing off a part of his pants at the knee. Blood ran down his leg from where he'd been cut. He only glanced down for a second to see how bad the cut was, but it had already started to heal up as he moved out of the way of the leg of a centipede trying to pin him down. For some reason, he did a double take at his leg. An odd expression came over his face, and he was distracted long enough to get caught by the side of a pincer. I shot too late. His body was tossed aside, bouncing off the ground painfully. My bullet landed on the side of one of the centipedes and between the joints of the creature. I swore I heard it let out a cry of pain as the bullet exploded, the shockwave kicking up sand into my eyes. Coughing, I took off trying to find where Nick had landed. Sensing weakness, the uninjured creature started to attack the other one, trying to eat its partner. I ran, only focused on finding Nick. His black suit stood out on the bright sand. I nearly tripped trying to stop beside him. One of his arms was twisted and clearly broken. From how he was breathing, I would bet that hit also broke some ribs. His pant leg was already well on its way to trying to repair itself. Hooking him under the arms, I dragged him behind a rock and prayed it would keep us safe as Nick recovered. I forgot how heavy Nick was every time I needed to drag him somewhere. His wheezing breathing was not getting much better. Keeping him on his back, I kept watch, waiting for those creatures to notice us or for someone to come and help out. A few minutes passed and Nick appeared to be healing. "Skylar," he said hoarsely, not opening his eyes yet. "Nicky, what happened? You were doing so well." I quickly got to his side to take his good hand. I was worried not only about his injuries, but about why he suddenly stopped dodging in the middle of a fight. What was so wrong that distracted him so much? His eyes opened and I've never seen him so distraught before. The sounds of the monsters fighting faded as my stress levels spiked, staring up at the bright sky with such a defeated look on his face. He spoke in a low voice I needed to lean in to hear. "They're not black." I had no idea what he was going on about. Just before he was hit, he was looking at his leg. His self-repairing suit hadn't fully fixed itself yet. Looking down, I spotted part of his bare leg and the kind of socks he was wearing. For a moment I was distracted by some tattoos running down his leg in such a light ink I almost missed them. The tattoos were a mess of circles and ancient writing showing they were connected to him and made through alchemy. The interconnecting circles were hidden by a high sock with cute lion heads decorating the top of them. At this point I knew Nick liked animals. Him having cute socks wasn't really a surprise. Aside from the cartoon lions, the rest of the sock was black. Surely, he wasn't talking about those, right? Looking back at his face, I opened my mouth to question him only to not find the words. "I'm a failure of an agent," Nick said, still staring upwards. I wanted to slam my face into the ground. He nearly died because he grabbed the wrong socks that morning. I suppressed a scream of utter frustration. What was the corporation doing to my poor partner to traumatize him like this? I wanted to shake him by the shoulders, but broken ribs would probably crack even more if I did so. "Mickey," I said in the sweetest tone I could muster, "they're just socks. If anyone gives you a hard time about it, I'll punch their faces in. I think you've earned the right to wear what you want. Now we need to deal with a more important problem." The pair of centipedes were now eating everything around them again at a frightening speed. Mickey was right. If we left them alone for too long, they would eat through the planet in no time at all. They had already devoured enough to create a crater around them. They needed to be stopped. My bullets weren't going to be much help. Nick finally sat up, his face returning to normal. His chest was still injured and his arm was still in pain, but he could work through it. "A pincer is cracked," Nick pointed out as we both watched the creatures dig around. He was right. Near the base, one of the pincers had a crack running through it. With one good hit, it might be able to get blown off. An idea was forming in my mind. One of the things about magic was the issue with wording. On our first case, Nick couldn't find the trail that led into the Witcher's territory. He needed to follow a human like myself to be able to enter it. There were scratches along each of the creatures' bodies, slowly healing up. For something that couldn't be cut by anything, how did they get hurt? "I have an idea," I said to Nick, wondering if the weakness with wording applied to these creatures as well. He listened, unsure if my plan would pan out. If it didn't, we would still be waiting on backup. At least this gave us a shot at killing one of these monsters. We weren't certain if Nick was strong enough to pull this off. At least we were trying something. Without any more time to waste, he stood up, ready to try it. We both moved from the spot, and closer to the insects eating away at the desert around us. One of them raised its head, staring at the small bits of food coming their way. They kept going on ahead as I raised my gun again. The centipede dove down, racing on all of its legs towards Nick. I held my breath, steadied my hand, and waited for the right time. Aiming towards the middle of the pincer, I fired. The crack already running through it caused the entire thing to be weak enough to be blown off by the extra powerful bullet. Nick ran through the shockwave to grab a hold of a large part of the broken pincer while the centipede was still reeling from the hit. The other one came down and I ran forwards to shoot it. The blast blew it back, causing it to topple on its back. The one with the broken pincer stood up, ready to come down on Nick. Holding the oversized pincer, he dodged just in time. Using all his strength, he shoved the sharp piece of the creature into the side of its head. It let out a cry of pain as Nick used all his remaining strength to slam against the pincer piece, digging it deeper and deeper into the monster. I shouted a warning just as the second one was recovering. Rolling on its side, the massive creature started towards Nick. He quickly picked up another broken piece that was about half his height. Standing his ground, he let the other centipede ram into the pointed edge, forehead first. They both were dragged across the rocky ground as the huge body was carried by the momentum. I was left panting and with sweat dripping off my face, just staring at both motionless creatures. I never expected us to be able to kill one, let alone both of the centipedes. Thinking around, the wording worked. Their bodies couldn't be cut, but they could be pierced, and the pincers could pierce anything. They had the weapons needed to kill them on their own heads the entire time. Still in shock and disbelief, I started to walk over to Nick, ready to fight if one of them happened to move. He was exhausted, his chest still obviously hurting, and his hands were torn up from holding the rough pieces. "Are they dead?" I asked slowly. As if to answer my question, the centipede's bodies started to show cracks. We tried to get away but weren't able to do so fast enough. Both bodies cracked open, thick purple blood exploding everywhere. We got completely covered in the stuff. I coughed, trying not to puke from the smell. We saved the world and the cost was almost too great. While trying to get the disgusting stuff from my face, a crowd of agents came running through the desert towards us. The backup had finally showed up. From the looks of things, they brought along some heavy-duty weapons and agents. Even Anker was in the group of who I assumed to be agents specializing in summoning or magic. They wore robes instead of suits. Each looked more like they should be a part of a fantasy novel than a government agency. Every one of them with shocked expressions on their faces. No one believed we killed the threat before they arrived. We admitted we weren't certain if any of the smaller bugs survived, so they went off to see if there were any creatures still alive that needed to be taken care of. Nick and I stood as Anker made his way over. His arms crossed. I sensed Nick get stressed. If his boss found out about his socks, he might get in trouble. I almost expected the grumpy man to compliment us over a job well done. That is going to stain, Anker commented and left. We saved the world. Would it kill him to be nice about it? We were sent home to get cleaned up. I didn't want to track the purple gunk into my apartment, so Nick offered to let me go over to his place. He had enough rooms for us both to get cleaned up at the same time. To my horror, Anker was right. The purple did stain. No matter how much I scrubbed, the color wouldn't fade from my hair. It dyed my normally dark brown hair almost black with a violet sheen to it. Some spare clothing that was a bit too big for me was set out. I wondered how bad Nick looked with the purple, and the answer came soon enough as he knocked on the bathroom door where I was looking for a hairdryer. I opened it to see his normally pale hair now a pastel purple. It was very hard not to laugh in his face. He helped me find a hairdryer that was hidden under the sink after digging out a package of other new grooming items. He'd placed new razors, soaps, and all sorts of items for any guests that may come by inside it. What we were looking for was behind an electric razor meant for styling hair. It was a brand I knew pretty well and was pretty excited over it. As Nick dried his hair, he watched as I was fawning over the razor set. When I was with my parents, they tried getting me into more girly hobbies. Cutting hair was one of them. It was the only thing that stuck. I did it on the side and styled all my friends' hair in school. Even charged some money for it. Soon nearly the entire school was paying me to do it. I swear, that paid for a year's worth of my nephew's diapers. Back then, money was tight. I did almost anything I could to earn a few bucks. Mowing lawns, collecting cans, snow shoveling, you name it. The hair cutting brought in a decent amount because I was good at it. And it saved money because myself and my sister never needed to pay someone to do our hair. Nick's hair was getting pretty long and choppy in places. He never bothered to take better care of it. I was harassing him to at least even it out, or cut off the dead ends for a while. I turned on the razor and looked over at him with a devilish gleam in my eyes. I can style your hair if you want. He looked from me to the buzzing razor, his face a little pale. It's fine. I doubt any styling would suit me. Taking one step closer, I kept a smile on my face, trying to sound convincing. You would look cute with an undercut. It wouldn't even take very long, let me just. To try and get his smaller partner back under control, he turned on the hairdryer and blew hot air directly into my face. He may be armed with a hair dyer, but I was an expert at talking people into haircuts. I could sense it when they wanted one, but their self-confidence was too low to think they could pull off a certain style. At first, they might freak out a little. In the end, they always felt proud of how much of a difference just cutting their hair made. In the next 10 minutes, I talked him into just looking up what different styles looked like on my phone. That was when I knew I had him already convinced. If they were looking, they were already considering the haircut. Nick was such a pushover. It only took another 5 minutes to have him sitting down in front of the bathroom mirror with a towel over his shoulders to catch the loose strands. I was totally right in that he looked damn cute with only half of his head shaved. I kept it a bit longer than just shaving it close to his skull. It was a big change, but he deserved to look nice once in a while. He fiddled with his hair in front of the mirror, and I cleaned up the mess on the bathroom floor. Tossing the leftover hair in the trash, he looked over. "You're just throwing it out?" he asked, a bit confused. At first, I didn't know what he meant. Then I realized this must be the first time anyone just tossed away his hair instead of treating it like a sample to be used. After all, I'd wanted to fix his hair before the corporation messed it up by chopping off pieces at random to study. Should I have kept it? I asked, unsure. Shaking his head, Nick smiled. It hurt my chest every time he did let a smile slip. It was a rare expression. His smiles almost always happened for a heartbreaking reason. He finally found someone who wanted to cut his hair just for the fun of it and not to use him. I needed to think of something else. "You know, you don't look like this uptight agent when you smile. Or with the purple hair," I commented. I was glad he looked like a normal person for once. His expression fell into a slightly panicked one. His eyes darting from between the mirror and myself, he knew it was the truth. He didn't look like an agent. His hair needed to grow back before he did. With the pinkish color before, he was pushing the official government look. Now there was no way anyone was going to take him seriously. I knew the look on his face. I've seen it pretty often. It was from all the students who went behind their parents' backs to get their hair styled. Regret always came, thinking they would be grounded forever. Nick was having a silent freak out. I'd talked him into this, so I needed to calm him down. Nothing was going to happen to him. No, he wasn't going to be fired. It was just a haircut. If any of his bosses got mad, they could give him some vacation days until it grew back out. He had earned some, after all. It took an hour for me to feel as if Nick was fine enough to be on his own for the night. We both needed some rest after saving the world. I didn't regret talking him into the hairstyle. He needed to like his appearance for a short while. Apparently, his hair grew fast and would be back to normal in about 2 weeks. Nothing to worry about. I could sleep easy knowing my partner was standing up for himself more. Not only was he now adopting the pets he wanted, he could also wear mostly black socks while knowing someone had his back. I went home to sleep that night, unaware of what kind of issue a simple haircut would cause. I was only asleep for a few hours when someone came into my room. Startled, I sat up, ready to fight off whoever had broken into my place. I was still half asleep as a man wearing a suit grabbed my arm. I was pulled out of bed, my door opened and pushed into a long hallway. "I'm sorry, but Anchor sent me to get you. No time to get dressed," the agent said as he kept us moving. My brain slowly started to work. I was being dragged down the corporation hallway towards Anchor's office in the middle of the night. For what? The agent was nervous, face creased in stress. He didn't even bring me right to the office door. He pushed me forwards and darted behind a fake potted plant as if it could protect him. "A lot of us will miss you if you die, so be careful," he commented in a small voice. What was he talking about? There couldn't be anything I'd done recently to piss off a certain grumpy boss this much. I was a bit upset at being woken up so rudely that I didn't even think of the obvious as I opened the door to go inside. Anchor was waiting, arms crossed, sitting in a chair across from a couch in the middle of the room. I walked over, fuming from getting dragged out of bed for this. Nick sat, his sword across his lap, eyes down, unable to look at anything but the floor. "Did you do this?" the large man growled, gesturing a clawed hand over towards my partner. That was what this was all about. I could strangle him. My anger was getting the better of me. I stood next to the couch, refusing to sit down, still in the baggy clothing Nick had lent me. I was sleeping. This couldn't wait until morning. I hissed. Anchor shot up. Nick stayed sitting, but he raised his hands as if that would help. "Do you have any idea what you did? Do you have any brains in your head? Nicholas is useless until this is fixed. We cannot put him in front of the public for any jobs." Anchor's voice shook the table in front of him. I should have backed down, but I only got more pissed. Nick would just have to do different jobs or take a break. I knew that there was a huge backlog of cases, but damn it, my partner had gone through enough and earned the right to feel good about himself. And give him time off. You're acting as if this is the end of the world. It's just a haircut, for Christ's sake. You shouldn't even be able to control something like this. You're his boss, not his father. There was no way I could have known talking back would be such an issue. I knew Anchor would be angry, but not violent. Once the words were out of my mouth, he picked up the chair next to him and tossed it at my head. It missed by mere millimeters. The wood exploded against the wall, denting it. I was unable to move as his face changed into something closer to an animal. His teeth became so large they couldn't fit in his mouth, and his eyes were glowing. "I'll kill you if you speak like that again." Anchor roared so loud everything in his office shook. Something happened that I also never would have thought possible. Nick moved so fast neither of us could react. With one foot on the table, he slammed the other onto Anchor's chest, forcing him back into the chair, his one hand on his scabbard, and the other on the hilt of the blade, exposing an inch. He was looking down at the larger man, his back facing me. "I'll never forgive you if you harm my partner." His voice was low. It chilled the air and made the entire room heavy. I never knew Nick would draw his sword against his boss if my life was threatened. That was something he could be fired for. And if the corporation no longer needed him, they may decide to use his entire body for experiments. Nick was risking his life in that moment. Slowly, Anchor started to shift back to a more human face. Not calm, but not as angry as before. "How disgusting. Your partner has no strength of his own. Humans are weak, always relying on others." Neither of them moved. Anchor appeared as disgusted as he sounded. My hands trembled, unsure of what kind of outcome might happen if I spoke up. I needed to reply, but not to disagree with the statement. "I do rely on others. I trust them and they trust me. We offer each other help freely because we care about each other. That's a human strength. They're able to accept help if needed. If you did go through with hurting me, Nick wouldn't be the only one upset and after your head. I've found a lot of people I care about in the past few months who would turn on you. You might be able to tear down this entire building. But if something happened to you, would anyone care?" We all fell silent for a while. The truth of those words was sinking in. Everyone was afraid of Anchor. He didn't have a single person to back him up. His own employee was staring him down, with a hand on his sword and ready to protect his partner instead of siding with his boss. "It appears you have me cornered. If your strength in numbers trumps my own, what are you going to do with it? Get your little friends to kill me in discard of a problem?" he growled, and Nick stiffened a little. No, nothing. Just do your job and we won't have any issues. I don't care enough about you to have my friends risk getting hurt fighting an angry old man. Just stop giving Nick a hard time and we'll be fine. It was just a haircut, I repeated in my head. How did it turn out like this again? Anchor gave us both a hard look. He moved, one hand grabbing Nick by the back of his shirt to put him back down on the ground. I figured he could have won in a fight if Nick did attack him. If they got into it, one of them would have died. It was crazy thinking about what nearly happened because of such a simple thing. Get out of my office, boys. Do not speak a word of this to anyone or else I shall punish you. A pair of rough hands were placed on both of our backs to be shoved very rudely from the office. The door slammed behind us so hard, it cracked the wooden frame it was in. We stood in the hallway, shocked, just waiting in case Anchor changed his mind and came out really upset at us. Somehow, we had lived through the encounter and emerged without a scratch. Do you think he knows he called us both boys? I pointed out, not knowing what else to say. Nick didn't answer, his legs rigidly straight. He moved awkwardly over to the potted plant only to bend over and puke into it. I rushed over to see how he was doing. Threatening Anchor stressed him out way more than I thought. Without much in his stomach, he was just throwing up bile. I sat with him, hand on his back, regretting how he was feeling. Your hair looks great, by the way, I mentioned. His mouth was pressed against the back of his hand. The sound he made was either him throwing up in his mouth or a snort of a laugh. Saving the world was easy compared with trying to deal with a raging boss. I wasn't going to sleep that night. That much was for certain. I would rather fight giant centipedes every day than deal with Anchor again. From how Nicky looked, he might agree with that idea.